Games are an increasingly popular topic in the field of applied linguistics. I mean, think about it. The prospect of being able to have fun in a foreign language class while simultaneously improving some objective aspect of that language sounds a little too good to be true, right? So, is it true? Can we really play games in foreign language classes? Are games any better than traditional methods of classroom instruction for foreign languages? Are they any worse? That's part of what this research has explored, mostly through the objective lens of L2 vocabulary acquisition, measured by vocabulary testing with two types of instructional methods. So, let's get into it. The two methods of instruction were, as you probably have guessed, games and reading articles, both conducted in the L2, in this case English, in university-level courses at a Japanese university. First, we'll be going over which games and articles were used for what kinds of classes. Then we'll move into what this research was trying to objectively measure, namely if there is a difference between measured vocabulary acquisition for each instructional media type. After that, I will detail the vocabulary tests and in-class protocols, and conclude with an overview of the most pertinent results and a discussion of how these results may be interpreted. Each class took place in a 15-week semester and met once weekly for 90-minute classes. The curriculum consisted of 2 games and 2 articles or oral presentations for each class represented in the study, the entirety of which was conducted over 2 academic years in 4 separate classes. The first game played was a board game called Welcome to Your Perfect Home about housing market value creation. This game was played in the first half of the semester, approximately 7 weeks, in an English reading course in the spring semester of 2022. Almost all the remaining courses represented in this study were also English reading courses, and so the acronyms will generally follow this pattern. We played this game while discussing how rules and legislation can exert a direct influence over the creation and subsequent valuation of housing markets. For the gaming section of the curriculum, we mostly just played the game in class. For the article portion of the curriculum, though, thematically similar articles were chosen as a way to connect the content of the game to a real-world context, a practice known as bridging. For this course about housing market value creation, an article by Alan Durning comparing how legislation in Japan and the US has created vastly different housing market landscapes and some housing market crises in the US was chosen. The in-class discussions that took place in tandem with reading the article were actively compared to how the gameplay mechanics in Welcome to functionally represent the concepts talked about in the article. In the same class, another game called Modern Art about the value creation of visual art through auctioning was also used. This game was played in the latter half of the spring semester and was used to discuss the concepts of utility and collective utility, specifically how these concepts relate to the value creation for something which has no real intrinsic value, such as visual art. To drive this point home, an article about NFTs was used to highlight how the valuation of images, digital or otherwise, is largely dependent on a collective market of people who all happen to agree that the image has value. It's all about the hype, so to speak. Again, these discussions arising from reading the article were then actively tied back into the class to form concrete examples from the game itself. In the next class, English Reading 2, in the fall semester of 2022, the digital smartphone application version of a social deduction game called Among Us was played. The curriculum focused on how competitive scenarios create incentives for deception and betrayal, such as in The Prisoner's Dilemma. The article read in class was about how digital games may have applications outside of entertainment, such as medical interventions for cognitive disorders such as Alzheimer's and ADHD. In the latter half of the semester, the game Forbidden Island was played, a cooperative game in which players must work together to win. The curriculum focused on how the Shapley value may be used in cooperative scenarios to divide up the rewards in groups known as coalitions. To this point, an article on a game theory analysis of the structure of the Paris Climate Accord, a climate change coalition, was used to talk about how to build trust in cooperative scenarios. In the next English reading class in the spring semester of 2023, the board game The Settlers of Catan about the trading and management of resources was used to talk about the differences between plans and strategies in competitive business scenarios. To that point, an article talking about various applications of strategy in business was used to bridge the content of the game to this curricular goal. In the latter half of the semester, the board game The Crew, The Quest for Planet 9 was played. The Crew is a trick-taking game which runs alongside a sci-fi narrative of scientists looking for the elusive ninth planet. But not Pluto, he was demoted. Another cooperative game, this game was used to talk about the importance of communication strategies in group scenarios. To this end, an article detailing different communication styles was used in conjunction with gameplay. In the last class represented in this study, a communication English class in the fall semester of 2023, and hence the different acronym, the games of Among Us and Forbidden Island were used to talk about similar topics. However, there were some structural differences in the curriculum, namely that there were student oral presentations on the game topics instead of articles, and the type of vocabulary tests which were taken were different, a point which will be explained in detail a little later. So in order to see if there are any objective differences between the L2 vocabulary acquisition that occurred between gameplay and reading articles, the following research questions were devised. Number 1, will the type of instructional media, so either games or articles, affect how well non-native students are able to guess the meaning to self-identified unknown English vocabulary? And number 2, will the type of instructional media, again, either games or articles, affect how well non-native students perform on tests of the collective whole of unknown English vocabulary after participating in the curriculum? And since the curricular design for the above two research questions involved providing students with access to vocabulary study guides prior to testing, number 3, can games alone create a context for the implicit learning of English vocabulary without self-studying resources? Next, let's talk about how the vocabulary tests were designed to objectively measure L2 vocabulary growth from the curriculum. Basically, before playing a game or discussing an article in class, the students were given 10 minutes to read through or play through the rulebook, the article, or the game itself. While doing this, the students were told to record any unknown English word they came across in the vocabulary survey, a link to which I have embedded into this presentation, which has been made available online. The vocabulary survey taken via Google Forms was conducted entirely in Japanese, but I have provided an English translation of the structure of the survey here. The students were instructed to input the unknown word into the form, then without using a dictionary to try to guess the meaning of the input word in Japanese. The guessed Japanese definitions of these unknown English words were subsequently graded, but the grades were not shared with the students. The grades on the vocabulary survey did not affect their overall course grade, but they did receive participation points for the submission of these vocabulary surveys. For each game and article pairing, the entries to the vocabulary surveys were collated into an online study guide on the website Quizlet. The study guides provided students with the correct Japanese definition to the collective whole of the input English vocabulary. I have embedded a link into this presentation as an example of one of these study guides. And 1 week after posting the study guides, the students were given a multiple choice test for all the words in the study guides in random order. I have embedded an example of this test in the presentation. The multiple choice test consisted of the English word with 4 possible answers in Japanese, only one of which was the correct answer. All vocabulary tests were conducted via Google Forms. The answers were automatically randomized, and automated corrective feedback was provided to the students upon submission of the test. As all the answers to the tests were online and all the tests were conducted via smartphones and Google Forms links, there was the possibility for students to cheat on this test. However, the grading structure used in the course disincentivized cheating, as students were explicitly instructed that performance on the tests would not affect their course grade and that they would receive full credit for simply submitting the tests. However, as a way to further discourage cheating, all students were required to and willingly submitted statements of cooperation. These statements were, again, collected in Japanese, but the English translation is provided here and asks students whether they agree to not using a dictionary to answer the test questions. Finally, for the communication English class, the vocabulary from previous classes, which played the same games, was used to create a 20-question multiple-choice test. The students had to take the pre-game vocabulary test prior to starting the curriculum. An example of this test is provided as an embedded link in this presentation. The multiple-choice test provided the target word in a sentence bracketed off in parentheses and provided 4 possible Japanese translations, only one of which was the correct answer. Upon completion of the curriculum, the students then had to take the post-game vocabulary test, which was identical to the pre-test except for the automatic randomization of answers provided by Google Forms. For this course, no online study guides were provided, as this class was trying to test whether the games were able to elicit the implicit growth of L2 vocabulary from gameplay alone. As a summary of the most important in-class protocols, each game and article unit took place during 7 weeks, with a total of 2 game article units per semester. While playing the games, no explicit instruction was provided on in-game vocabulary. However, while reading the articles, students were not only asked if there were words in the articles which they did not understand, but explicit instruction was also provided on some words from the article which were determined to be crucial to understanding the key points of the article. The content of the games and articles were related, but some articles and gameplay mechanics were more related than others. All courses except for the Communication English course, so all English reading courses with the articles, were provided with access to online study guides for the purposes of self-study. All students were provided with explicit instruction prior to testing that performance on these tests would not affect their grades, therefore there was no reason to cheat. Next, let's take a look at the most pertinent results of the study. The vocabulary survey scores for games were significantly higher than those for articles, with a p-value of less than 0.001 as measured by a paired two-tailed t-test. Power analysis also revealed that these results are statistically reliable. However, for the vocabulary tests on the collective whole, as well as individually assessed survey-only scores, no significant differences between articles and games were observed. This means that vocabulary growth from games and articles were approximately at the same level. Regarding the implicit vocabulary tests from the Communication English course, a moderately significant post-test increase was observed in the Among Us test, but not in the Forbidden Island test. Although this test result is not so reliable as indicated by a paired power analysis due to a low sample size. With that being said, these results potentially indicate that games may elicit implicit growth of L2 vocabulary, but not for every game. However, the lack of growth in the Forbidden Island test results may be the result of the pre-test being too easy relative to the Among Us test. Despite these tests being from the exact same class, there was a highly significant difference observed between the pre-tests results, which have reliable statistical power despite the low sample size, potentially indicating that the Forbidden Island test may need to be rewritten and then retaken before reliable interpretations may be made. Regarding the differences in post-test results from both the English reading courses, which were provided with online study guides, and then the Communication English course, which relied on gameplay alone, there were no significant differences observed. This potentially indicates games can elicit similar levels of implicit L2 growth without other classroom interventions. All data distribution for measured vectors were normally distributed, except for the total vocabulary scores for both the game and article tests in the English reading courses. The data distribution of these tests are negatively skewed, meaning that a cohort of students were significantly underperforming relative to the rest of the students. This may potentially be the result of some students randomly selecting answers, knowing that a low score would not negatively impact their grade, as long as the test was submitted on time. This non-normal distribution was measured with a Jacques-Berat test. And here is the data distribution for the article scores, again showing significant negative skewness. As normal distribution is required for t-test results to be reliably interpretable, the article and game vocabulary test scores for the English reading courses were also compared using a non-parametric Wilcoxon signed rank test, for which no significant differences were observed. There was a weak positive correlation observed of significance between the game survey scores and vocabulary scores for both games and articles, albeit with weak predictability. With that being said, the negative skewness of the test scores are interfering with the reliability of this predictive model. It may therefore be said in general that there is a correlation between how well students performed on the game surveys and the later vocabulary tests. Although the same correlation was not observed between the article survey scores, the weak correlations are being highly influenced by the scores causing the negative skewness in the data distribution. It may therefore be assumed that performance on the article surveys is also tentatively predictive of performance on the vocabulary tests. A particularly surprising result of the analysis was that the only digital game, Among Us, significantly outperformed all other games and articles which required students to read through the material, to a decent degree of statistical reliability. In contrast to articles and board games, which the students were required to read through, Among Us placed students into an interactive environment which exposed them to English vocabulary in a highly contextualized and multimodal environment. These results are also likely not due to the class taking the Among Us vocabulary survey simply having a higher level of English ability, as the same class's score for the Among Us article survey was significantly lower to a high degree, with a very high level of statistical significance. This indicates that the environment of the digital game may be more conducive at allowing students to accurately guess the meaning to unknown L2 words relative to other media types, including board games and articles. To that point, the argument could be made that if the type of instructional media plays a role in how students acquire L2 vocabulary, then varying media types should elicit varying levels of scores independent of the class group. Put another way, if the media type doesn't matter, then you would expect test scores to conform to the classes which took them. As a review, the following classes played the following games and read articles based on their gameplay content. As all classes will have students of varying degrees of English ability, you would expect that scores on vocabulary surveys would conform to the class group. However, this is not what we see for the game surveys. There is no obvious correlation between the ranking of survey scores and class group, potentially indicating that the media type was playing a significant role in how well students were able to infer the meaning to unknown L2 vocabulary. This assumption is supported by the significant difference in scores between game and article survey scores. And when we look at the vocabulary survey scores for the articles, the score rankings align perfectly to the class groups. This may indicate that the media of articles do not affect the ability of students to infer the meaning of unknown L2 vocabulary as much as games do, whereby students relied more on their innate English ability than the context of the media itself. Upon testing, there were 3 specific games which experienced drastic shifts in ranking relative to survey scores, 2 negative and 1 positive. Furthermore, with the exception of the Welcome To game scores, there is much more alignment to the class groups relative to the game survey scores, potentially indicating that there is something about the treatment of the Welcome To unit which elicited a higher magnitude of L2 vocabulary growth. When looking at the article vocabulary test scores, there is again an alignment with the class groups, except for the modern art article scores, which drop dramatically in rank. When you compare these rankings with the game score rankings, there is a high level of alignment, potentially indicating that there is some kind of synergistic effect between the articles and games at play. And here are those results. As you can see, they're almost identical, except with the Welcome To test just jumping 1 rank in the articles. But other than that, exactly the same. So when looking at a ranking which describes which game test scores experienced the largest shifts in score relative to the survey scores, again, Welcome To seems to stand out. Although entirely speculative, the level of alignment between gameplay and article content may be driving these results, whereby higher levels of content alignment between the game and the article result in higher levels of L2 vocabulary growth. Again, although entirely speculative, this ranking seems to reflect the level of alignment between the game and the article, whereby the Welcome to article directly dealt with the rules governing housing construction, read alongside a game about building the most valuable neighborhoods, and then the Among Us article, in contrast, dealt with how games in general may have health applications in the field of psychology, read alongside a game about the nature of deception set on board a spacecraft. Also, when looking at a ranking of the largest magnitudes of change between survey and test scores for the articles, there appears to be some kind of effect that the game is exerting on the results of the article test scores. As in contrast to the article survey scores, the largest changes in test scores relative to the survey baseline do not align to the class groupings at all. At the very least, the relative magnitude of L2 vocabulary growth seems to be a function of some kind of interaction between the game, the articles, and the curriculum itself. So let's talk about what these results mean for the research questions introduced earlier. Regarding research question 1 about whether the results of the vocabulary surveys will be significantly different for games and articles, the answer appears to be yes. Games were shown to elicit higher levels of accuracy for inferential guessing as to the meaning of unknown English vocabulary. This effect was particularly pronounced with the digital game Among Us relative to articles in board games, or put another way, better than just reading. This result may be caused by the interactive nature of digital games, which allows players to explore a highly contextualized multimodal in-game environment with an avatar, whereby the gameplay mechanics are designed to successfully push the players forward through the game. These kinds of mechanics may be beneficial for the inferential processing of unknown vocabulary encountered during gameplay. Regarding research question 2 about whether there is an effect of the media type, that is, either games or articles, on the overall outcome of vocabulary tests on the unknown vocabulary collected by the students, there is probably not a large difference between the two media types, as the differences in vocabulary test scores for each medium were negligible. However, considering the significant difference in successful inferential processing of unknown L2 vocabulary prior to testing, there very well may be a significant difference in terms of the long-term retention of said vocabulary, which has not been tested here. However, in other research that I have done, L2 vocabulary acquired from gameplay and corrective feedback demonstrated significantly better long-term retention of L2 vocabulary acquired through testing procedures and corrective feedback alone, so there is precedence for this line of argument. Also, a point worth considering is that even though the treatment of vocabulary from games and articles were given different in-class treatments, games proved to be equally as effective as reading articles in class for the purpose of eliciting L2 vocabulary growth. Finally, regarding research question 3 about whether games can elicit vocabulary growth without the use of online study guides, the answer is, well, maybe. In other research that I have conducted, digital games, particularly narrative-centered RPGs, have been shown to elicit the implicit acquisition and long-term retention of L2 vocabulary. In this research as well, the digital game Among Us was shown to elicit moderately significant L2 vocabulary growth implicitly, whereas the board game Forbidden Island did not. With that being said, the overly easy test for Forbidden Island may have disrupted the reliability of arguing that digital games are better suited than other genres of games for implicit L2 vocabulary acquisition and long-term retention. So let's wrap things up with a discussion about what these results mean for educators in the foreign language classroom. First and foremost, the media type of instruction does appear to have an effect on the way that students are able to infer the meaning to unknown L2 vocabulary, and this effect is particularly pronounced with digital games. But before you scramble to change your curricula to integrate more digital games, it should also be noted that this inferential boost to guessing the meaning to unknown vocabulary did not translate to better vocabulary scores relative to other methods of instruction, such as reading articles in class. With that being said, though, games were also shown to be equally as effective as this other type of traditional instructional method, so educators who are interested in using games in the foreign language class may at least rest assured that playing games will still help students improve their L2 vocabulary skills, and probably just as well as other instructional methods such as reading articles in class. It was also argued in the interpretation of the results that aligning bridging activities closely to the content of the game, such as was done in the Welcome to curriculum, may help to increase the magnitude of L2 vocabulary growth. So, for educators who are interested in using games in a foreign language classroom, paying special attention to how closely the bridging activities align to the content of the game may be just as beneficial as focusing on what game to play, digital or otherwise. Also, providing access to self-study materials did not elicit better vocabulary growth than the implicit method. So, if the educator is interested in an implicit instructional method, the results of this study indicated that the implicit method is at least statistically comparable to explicit instructional methods. However, if an educator employs an implicit teaching method, grading methods for coursework should be adjusted in such a way which does not penalize students for not performing well on a test that they could not really have studied for. As a parting note of observation, as I cannot really say for certainty whether games are any better than traditional methods of vocabulary instruction, I did notice that students were much more engaged during gameplay than they were reading articles. While it must also be said that not all students were extremely motivated by the games we played in class, there were numerous occasions during which students were actually sleeping in class while we were reading the articles. Although there are certainly caveats to game-based learning which are not directly addressed in this research, one of the benefits of using games as instructional media is how they necessitate classroom engagement. Because, it's really hard to play a game if you're not playing it. At least for the purpose of L2 vocabulary growth, using games in the foreign language classroom may represent an equally effective and decisively more engaging alternative to more traditional teaching methods. Okay, so here's a list of my references in order of appearance. And if you are interested in some other research which I conducted with the games represented in this research, as well as some of the foundational research upon which this study was based, please feel free to check out these links which I have embedded into this presentation. Thank you for sticking it out with me to the end, and hopefully you will be able to walk away with something useful. If you are interested in contacting me, please use either of these two email addresses. Okay, thanks. Bye.